I was 8 when I first realized I was invisible. It was Daniel's birthday party, and Mom had spent weeks planning it. She'd made his favorite chocolate cake, decorated the house with superhero banners, and invited half his class. I remember sitting at the kitchen table watching her fuss over every detail. When I asked if I could help blow out the candles, she barely looked up. "It's Daniel's special day, sweetheart. Maybe next time." That became the pattern. Daniel was always the center of everything. He had this way of commanding attention without even trying. When relatives visited, they'd ruffle his hair and ask about his soccer games, his grades, his latest adventure. I'd stand there, waiting for someone to notice me, but their eyes would drift right past. It wasn't that they didn't love me. They just seemed to forget I existed when Daniel was around. School was different. I was good at math, really good. My teachers would praise my work, and for a few hours each day I felt like I mattered. But when I'd come home excited about an A on a test, Dad would nod absently and ask Daniel about his practice. "Great job, honey," he'd say to me, then turn immediately to my brother. "So tell me about that goal you scored." The worst part wasn't being ignored. It was the comparisons. Every achievement I had was measured against Daniel's. When I made honor roll, Mom would say, "That's wonderful. Daniel made honor roll too when he was your age, plus he was team captain." When I got into advanced placement classes, Dad would mention how Daniel had been in those same classes and still found time for 3 sports. They never meant to hurt me, but each comparison felt like a small knife. By high school, I'd learned to keep my victories to myself. I won a state math competition and barely mentioned it at dinner. I figured if I didn't bring attention to my successes, they couldn't be diminished. But that backfired too. Without fanfare, my achievements became footnotes in family conversations. Daniel's touchdown last Friday was front-page news. My scholarship offer was buried in small print. College applications were the breaking point. I'd worked for months on my essays, researched schools, prepared for interviews. I got into MIT with a full scholarship. When I told my parents, Mom hugged me and said she was proud. Then she immediately called Daniel at his state school to tell him the news. I could hear his voice through the phone. Cool, good for her. That was it. No excitement, no congratulations. Just cool. I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me. Maybe I wasn't interesting enough, or funny enough, or bold enough. Daniel had this magnetic personality that drew people in. He'd walk into a room and suddenly everyone was laughing. I'd walk into the same room and people would keep talking as if I hadn't arrived. It wasn't his fault, but it still stung. Family dinners became exercises in endurance. Daniel would tell stories about his internship, his girlfriend, his weekend plans. Everyone would hang on every word. When I'd try to share something about my research project or my part-time job, the conversation would somehow circle back to him within minutes. I'd finish my sentences to empty air while everyone listened to Daniel's latest adventure. The strange thing was, I genuinely admired my brother. He was charismatic and confident in ways I'd never be. But living in his shadow was exhausting. I felt like I was constantly running a race where the finish line kept moving. No matter how fast I ran or how far I got, Daniel was always miles ahead in everyone's eyes. Eventually, I stopped trying to compete. I focused on my own path, my own goals. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought, but deep down it did matter. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. Mom's voice sounded different when she called that Tuesday evening. Softer, more careful than usual. I was in my apartment in downtown Chicago reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't answer. After avoiding the last 3 family gatherings, I knew she'd have questions I wasn't ready to face. "Sarah, honey, I know you've been busy with work," she started, and I could already hear the guilt building in her tone. "But it's been 8 months since we've all been together. Your dad's been asking about you." I set down my pen and rubbed my temples. 8 months. Had it really been that long? The last dinner had been Easter, and I'd left early after Daniel spent an hour describing his promotion to regional manager. Everyone had congratulated him like he'd cured cancer. When I'd mentioned closing my biggest client deal to date, the conversation had already moved on to dessert. "I don't know, Mom. Things are really hectic right now." It wasn't exactly a lie. I'd been working 12-hour days for the past 6 months, but not because I had to. Because I wanted to. Because building something from nothing felt better than sitting around a dinner table feeling like nothing. "Please, sweetheart. Daniel's bringing Emma to meet everyone. Emma was his latest girlfriend, a kindergarten teacher from his neighborhood. From Mom's Facebook posts, she was blonde, sweet, and everything a future daughter-in-law should be. And your cousin Mike is driving down from Milwaukee with the kids. It'll be like old times. Old times. That's exactly what I was afraid of. Old patterns, old dynamics, old feelings of inadequacy that I'd worked so hard to leave behind. I'd built a life in Chicago where people knew me for my work, not as Daniel's little sister, where my opinions mattered and my successes weren't immediately compared to someone else's. But there was something in Mom's voice that made me pause, a loneliness I'd never noticed before. Maybe she missed me more than I realized. Maybe avoiding family dinners had hurt her too. Okay, I heard myself saying. I'll be there. The relief in her voice was immediate. Oh, wonderful. Saturday at 6, just like always. I'll make your favorite lasagna. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment wondering what I'd just agreed to. The Chicago skyline glittered outside my window, a reminder of how far I'd come from that small house in Naperville where I'd grown up feeling invisible. I'd built something here, something that was entirely mine. 3 days later, I stood in my closet trying to decide what to wear. It felt ridiculous getting dressed for my own family, but I knew appearances mattered. If I showed up looking tired or unsuccessful, it would confirm what they probably already thought about my decision to avoid them. I settled on a black sweater and dark jeans. Professional but not trying too hard. The drive to Naperville felt longer than usual. Familiar landmarks passed by the highway, exit signs for my old high school, the mall where I'd worked summers during college. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. I'd forgotten how quiet suburbs could be after living in the city for so long. I pulled into the driveway behind Daniel's silver BMW. Of course, he was already there. He probably arrived early to help Dad with something and charm Mom in the kitchen. Through the window, I could see people moving around, hear the faint sound of laughter. For a moment, I considered backing out and driving home. I could text Mom later with an excuse about feeling sick, but I didn't. I turned off the engine, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and walked toward the front door. The porch light was on, and I could smell garlic and tomato sauce through the screen door. Mom's lasagna, just like she'd promised. Before I could knock, the door swung open. There she is. Mom's arms were around me before I could step inside. She smelled like vanilla perfume and cooking oil, exactly the same as always. Everyone's here. Daniel brought Emma, and she's lovely. Wait until you meet her. I followed her into the living room where voices mixed with the sound of a baseball game on TV. Daniel was on the couch, his arm around a petite blonde woman who smiled up at me with perfect teeth. Dad was in his recliner and Uncle Mike was telling some story about his kids' soccer season. Everyone looked comfortable, settled, like they belonged exactly where they were. Look who finally made it, Daniel said, standing to give me a quick hug. His smile was warm, but there was something behind it I couldn't quite read. Emma, this is my sister Sarah, the one I told you about. The dining room table looked exactly the same as it had for 20 years. Mom's good china, the burgundy tablecloth with the tiny stain from when I'd spilled grape juice at age 12. Dad's spot at the head with his reading glasses folded beside his plate. Even my chair was the same, third from the left, where I'd sat through countless homework discussions and birthday celebrations. Emma helped Mom carry dishes from the kitchen, chattering about the recipe and how wonderful everything smelled. She had that easy way of fitting in that some people just possess. Within 10 minutes, she was laughing at Dad's terrible jokes and asking Uncle Mike about his landscaping business, like she'd known them for years. I watched her navigate the family dynamics effortlessly, finding the right thing to say to each person. Sarah, tell Emma what you do in Chicago, Mom said as she settled into her chair. She works with computers, something very technical. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. After 6 years of building my consulting firm, I was still someone who works with computers to my family. I run a business consulting company, I said to Emma, who nodded politely. We help businesses streamline their operations, mostly through technology integration. That sounds fascinating, Emma said, and she seemed to mean it. What kind of businesses? Before I could answer, Daniel jumped in. She basically helps companies figure out how to use their computers better. Very practical stuff. He said it with a smile, but there was a dismissive edge that made my chest tighten. Nothing as exciting as teaching 5-year-olds, I bet. Emma laughed and launched into a story about her kindergarten class's recent field trip to the zoo. Everyone listened intently, asking questions and sharing their own memories of childhood field trips. I cut my lasagna into small pieces and tried to ignore the familiar feeling of fading into the background. The conversation flowed around the table like it always did, touching on sports, weather, neighborhood gossip. Dad complained about the Cubs' pitching rotation. Uncle Mike described his youngest daughter's piano recital. Mom updated everyone on Mrs. Peterson from next door, who'd apparently gotten a new hip. These were the rhythms of family dinner I'd grown up with, comfortable and predictable. "So Daniel tells me you're doing really well at the firm," Dad said, turning his attention to my brother. "Another promotion this year?" Daniel straightened in his chair, and I could see the familiar spark of pride in his eyes. "Actually, they're moving me to the Singapore office next year. Regional Director for Southeast Asia, it's a pretty big deal." The table erupted in congratulations. Mom clapped her hands together. Dad reached over to shake Daniel's hand, and Emma beamed like she'd won the lottery herself. Uncle Mike raised his wine glass in a toast. "To Daniel, conquering Asia, one spreadsheet at a time." I joined the toast, lifting my glass with what I hoped looked like genuine enthusiasm. Daniel had always been good at his job. There was no denying that. He was smart, ambitious, and had a natural talent for managing people. The promotion was well-deserved, even if the celebration felt a bit excessive. "Singapore," Mom said, shaking her head in amazement. "My son, living in Singapore. Can you imagine?" "It's temporary," Daniel said, though he was clearly enjoying the attention. 2 years, maybe 3, but it's a great opportunity to expand my experience internationally." "And what about Emma?" Dad asked. "Will you be able to visit?" Emma's smile faltered just slightly. "We're still figuring that out. It's a long way." An awkward silence settled over the table for a moment. I felt a stab of sympathy for Emma, who was clearly trying to be supportive while processing what a long-distance relationship with Daniel would mean. I'd been there before, not with romantic relationships, but with the feeling of being an afterthought in someone else's big plans. "I'm sure you'll work it out," Mom said quickly, always the peacemaker. "Love finds a way, right?" The conversation moved on to logistics about the move, cost of living in Singapore, and whether Daniel would need to learn any new languages. I found myself studying the faces around the table, noting how animated everyone became when discussing Daniel's life. This was how it had always been. His successes became family celebrations, his challenges became family concerns. Everything revolved around his orbit.
"What about you, Sarah?" Emma asked suddenly, catching me off guard. "Any big changes coming up in your life?" All eyes turned to me, and I felt that familiar flutter of panic. What could I say that would sound interesting after Daniel's international promotion? That I'd been working on expanding my client base? That I'd hired 2 new employees? That I'd been featured in a trade publication that none of them would have heard of?
"Nothing as exciting as Singapore," I said with a small laugh. "Just the usual business growth stuff." Daniel leaned back in his chair, and I caught that look again. The one that said he was about to say something that would put me in my place, wrapped in the guise of brotherly concern. "Still working those crazy hours? You know, there's more to life than work, sis." Daniel's comment hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. "There's more to life than work, sis." The way he said it, with that condescending smile and the slight shake of his head, made something inside me snap. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet break, like a thread pulled too tight finally giving way. I set my fork down carefully and looked at him across the table. Really looked at him. His hair was perfectly styled, his shirt probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, and he had that satisfied expression he always wore when he thought he'd made a clever point. Emma was nodding along, probably thinking he was being a caring older brother. "You're right," I said quietly. "There is more to life than work." Daniel looked pleased, like he'd just delivered some profound wisdom. "Exactly. You should try to find some balance. Maybe take a vacation, meet someone nice. Life's too short to spend it all at the office." Mom was watching us with that worried expression she got whenever she sensed tension between her children. Dad was focused on his lasagna, probably hoping the conversation would move away from anything that might cause conflict. Uncle Mike was refilling his wine glass, deliberately not making eye contact with anyone. I actually have been thinking about balance lately, I continued, my voice steady. About what really matters. About being honest with people instead of letting them make assumptions. Something in my tone must have shifted, because Daniel's smile faltered slightly. Emma looked between us, sensing the undercurrent but not understanding it. Mom put her hand on Dad's arm, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when she was nervous. That's good to hear, Daniel said, but his voice was more cautious now. I just worry about you sometimes, you know? Living alone in that big city, working all the time, it's not healthy. There it was again. The concern that wasn't really concern. The worry that was actually judgment. The brotherly advice that was really just another way to remind everyone at the table that my life wasn't measuring up to his standards. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life, and I was tired of pretending it didn't bother me. I appreciate your concern, I said, meeting his eyes directly. But you don't need to worry about me anymore. Of course I worry. You're my little sister. He reached for his wine glass, confident again. It's what big brothers do. Actually, I have some news that might put your mind at ease. I picked up my water glass and took a small sip, buying myself a moment to find the right words. About that work-life balance thing. The table had gone quiet. Even the baseball game in the living room seemed muted. Mom was holding her breath, probably hoping I was about to announce an engagement or at least a serious boyfriend. Dad was finally looking up from his plate. Uncle Mike had stopped chewing. I've been working on something for the past year, I said. Something that's going to change things for me professionally. Daniel nodded encouragingly, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was already preparing his response, probably something about how it was great that I was finally taking my career seriously, or how he hoped I wouldn't get in over my head. It's actually related to your company, I continued. Hartwell Financial Group, right? His nod was more cautious now. Yeah, why? I smiled, and for the first time in years it felt completely genuine. Because as of last Tuesday I own it. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Emma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Mom's hand flew to her chest. Dad's eyes went wide behind his glasses. Uncle Mike's wine glass paused in midair. Daniel blinked once, twice, like he was trying to process words that didn't make sense. What did you say? I said I own Hartwell Financial Group. I bought the company last week. The words came out calm and clear, each one dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. The acquisition went through on Tuesday. That's... Daniel started, then stopped. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at me like I just told him I was actually an alien from another planet. That's not possible. The paperwork is pretty straightforward, I said, pulling out my phone. I can show you the press release if you want. It should be online by now. Mom found her voice first. Sarah, honey, what are you talking about? You work with computers. I run a business consulting firm, Mom. We specialize in operational efficiency and strategic acquisitions. Hartwell was one of our target companies. I looked back at Daniel, who was still staring at me in shock. We've been working on this deal for 18 months. But I would have known, Daniel stammered. I work there. I'm regional director for Southeast Asia. Someone would have told me. The announcement went out to all employees yesterday, I said gently. You probably haven't checked your email since you've been here. Emma was looking between us like she was watching a tennis match. Dad had set down his fork entirely. Mom was making small gasping sounds like she couldn't quite catch her breath. I don't understand, Daniel said. And for the first time in my life, he sounded genuinely confused instead of confidently condescending. You're saying you bought my company? My company? I'm saying I bought Hartwell Financial Group, yes, along with 2 other firms in the same market. It's part of a larger consolidation strategy. I took another sip of water, amazed at how calm I felt. Your Singapore position is still secure, by the way. That wasn't part of the restructuring. The rest of dinner passed in a strange, muted atmosphere. Conversations started and stopped abruptly, like everyone was afraid to say the wrong thing. Mom kept glancing between Daniel and me with a mixture of pride and confusion, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the woman sitting at her table. Dad asked a few careful questions about the acquisition, his accountant mind trying to wrap around the numbers involved. Daniel had gone very quiet. He finished his lasagna mechanically, responding to direct questions with short answers but offering nothing more. Emma tried to fill the silence with cheerful observations about the food and questions about family photos on the walls, but even her natural warmth couldn't lift the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the table. "So you've been planning this for over a year?" Dad asked, setting down his coffee cup. "The whole acquisition?" I nodded. 18 months of due diligence, financing arrangements, regulatory approvals. It's not the kind of thing you do overnight. "And you never mentioned it," Mom said, her voice soft with something that might have been hurt. "Not even a hint." "I don't usually talk about deals until they're finalized," I said. "Too many things can go wrong. I've learned it's better to let results speak for themselves." Uncle Mike leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "Jesus, Sarah. All this time we thought you were just... we had no idea you were operating at that level." "What level did you think I was operating at?" I asked, genuinely curious. The question hung in the air for a moment. Uncle Mike looked uncomfortable, glancing around the table for support. Mom fidgeted with her napkin. Dad cleared his throat but didn't answer. "We knew you were doing well," Mom finally said. "But we thought, well, you never talked about it much. We assumed it was a small operation. Maybe a few clients, working from home." "I have 43 employees across 3 offices," I said quietly. "Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit. We handle operational consulting for Fortune 500 companies. Last year we generated about $12 million in revenue." Emma's eyes widened. Daniel's head snapped up from his plate, and he stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not dismissal or condescension, but something closer to recognition, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. "12 million?" Mom whispered. "Gross revenue," I clarified. "But yes." The silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different. Less shocked, more thoughtful. I could almost see everyone recalibrating their mental image of my life, adjusting assumptions they'd held for years. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Dad asked. "Any of this?" It was a fair question, and I'd been asking myself the same thing all week. Honestly, because no one ever asked. Every time I came to dinner, the conversation was about Daniel's job, Daniel's promotion, Daniel's next big opportunity. When I tried to talk about my work, it got brushed aside or compared to his. After a while, I stopped trying. Daniel was still staring at me, his face unreadable. "You let us think." "I let you think what you wanted to think," I said. I never lied about anything. When people asked what I did, I told them. When they assumed it wasn't important, I didn't correct them. But at Christmas, when I was talking about the Singapore position, Daniel's voice trailed off. "You were excited about it. I didn't want to take that away from you. I meant it." Despite everything, I'd never wanted to hurt him. "Your promotion is a big deal, Daniel. Regional director is a great achievement." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Regional director. Working for my little sister. Working for Hartwell Financial Group," I corrected gently. "The ownership structure doesn't change your day-to-day responsibilities." Mom was crying quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks as she dabbed at them with her napkin. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. We should have paid more attention. We should have asked more questions." "It's okay, Mom." "No, it's not okay." Dad's voice was firm. "We made assumptions about your life, about your success, and we were wrong. That's on us, not you." Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "For what it's worth, I think what you've accomplished is incredible. Building a company from nothing, creating jobs for people, making deals at that level. It's amazing." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. Emma might have only known me for a few hours, but she seemed to understand something that my own family had missed for years. Daniel pushed back from the table abruptly. "I need some air," he said, and walked toward the back door without waiting for a response. Through the kitchen window, I could see him standing on the deck, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring out at Mom's garden. "He's processing," Emma said softly. "This is a lot to take in. For all of us," Mom added, wiping her eyes. "Sarah, honey, I hope you know how proud we are of you, even if we haven't done a good job of showing it." I looked around the table at their faces, these people who had shaped my entire life, who had loved me even when they didn't understand me. The anger I'd carried for so long was still there, but it felt smaller now, less sharp, like a wound that was finally starting to heal. I know," I said. And I hope you know that I never wanted to embarrass anyone tonight. That wasn't the point. What was the point? Dad asked. I thought about it for a moment. I guess I wanted you to see me. Really see me. Not as Daniel's little sister, or the quiet one who works with computers. Just me. 3 weeks later, I was back in my Chicago office when Daniel called. Not texted, not emailed, but actually called. I stared at his name on my phone screen for a moment before answering, wondering what this conversation would sound like now that everything had changed. Hey, he said, and his voice sounded different. Smaller somehow, less certain than I was used to. Do you have a minute? Sure. I minimized the spreadsheet I'd been reviewing and turned my chair toward the window. The city sprawled out below me, busy and anonymous and safe. What's up? I wanted to apologize, he said without preamble. For dinner, for a lot of things actually. I hadn't expected that. An explanation maybe, or questions about the business, but not an apology. Daniel, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm now, more like the brother I knew. I've been thinking about it for weeks. About how I treated you, how we all treated you. It wasn't fair. Through my office window, I watched people hurrying along the sidewalk far below, each one focused on their own destination, their own purpose. I'd built a life among these strangers that felt more authentic than the one I'd grown up with, but maybe that was about to change. I talked to Emma about it, Daniel continued. She helped me see some things I'd been blind to. Like how every time you tried to talk about your work, I'd either change the subject or make some comment that shut you down. You didn't mean to, but I did it anyway. Intent doesn't matter if the result is the same. He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. He was probably walking somewhere, maybe around his neighborhood like he did when he needed to think. Emma asked me why I always had to be the center of attention. I told her I didn't, but then I started paying attention to how I acted around the family. She was right. I leaned back in my chair, not sure what to say. This was the longest conversation Daniel and I had ever had about feelings, about our relationship, about anything deeper than surface-level family news. The thing is, he said, I think I knew you were successful. Maybe not the details, but I knew you weren't just scraping by. Your apartment, your clothes, the way you carried yourself. I chose not to see it because it was easier to keep thinking of you as my little sister who needed protecting. Or managing, I said quietly. Yeah, or managing. He laughed, but it sounded sad. God, I was such an ass. Standing there lecturing you about work-life balance when you just bought my entire company. You're good at your job, Daniel. The Singapore promotion wasn't charity. I know. But it's weird, you know? Finding out my little sister is essentially my boss. I keep wondering if other people at work knew, if they were laughing at me behind my back. No one was laughing at you, I said. The acquisition team was specifically instructed to evaluate all personnel based on merit alone. Your promotion came through normal channels before the deal was even finalized. You made sure of that. I made sure the process was fair. That's all. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Emma thinks I should ask you about the business. She says you probably have insights about the company that could help me do my job better. The old me would have downplayed that, would have said something self-deprecating about how he probably knew more about the day-to-day operations than I did. But that wasn't true, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. I'd be happy to share what I know, I said. The Southeast Asian market has a lot of potential for growth, but there are some structural challenges we identified during the acquisition process. Really? Like what? We talked for 20 minutes about market analysis, operational efficiency, and strategic positioning. It was the first real conversation we'd had about work, about business, about anything substantive. Daniel asked good questions and listened to my answers without trying to one-up me or prove he already knew everything. It felt like talking to a colleague, which was strange and wonderful and completely new. I should probably get back to work, he said eventually. But Sarah, I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. What you've built is incredible. Thank you, I said, and meant it. That means a lot. And I'm sorry it took buying my company to get my attention. I laughed, a real laugh that felt good in my chest. Well, it was pretty effective. After we hung up, I sat in my office for a while. watching the city move below me. The conversation had been good, better than I'd hoped. But I wasn't naive enough to think one phone call would erase 25 years of family dynamics. Change would take time, effort from everyone involved. Some conversations would be awkward. Some old patterns would resurface. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about my relationship with Daniel. Maybe we could learn to see each other as adults, as equals, as people with different strengths and different paths. Maybe we could even become friends. My assistant knocked on my door, reminding me about a client meeting in 10 minutes. I gathered my notes and straightened my jacket, shifting back into work mode. But as I walked to the conference room, I found myself thinking about the next family dinner. For the first time in years, I was actually looking forward to it. The dynamic had shifted, probably permanently. I was no longer the little sister who worked with computers, just like Daniel was no longer the undisputed family success story. We were both just people trying to figure out how to be siblings as adults, how to love each other without competing, how to celebrate each other's victories without feeling diminished. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe finally, it would be real.